neurotransmitter has exerted its effect on this other cell, whether that be another neuron, another muscle, whatever, that neurotransmitter has to be degraded or taken out of that synapse. And there's two main ways that you remove neurotransmitters from a synapse. So neurotransmitter termination, if you will, is done by two ways I consider here. One is by reuptake, and the other one is by degradation. So you have an enzyme sitting in the synapse that degrades that neurotransmitter. The one that's really pertinent here that you guys need to know is this reuptake, because that's where the axon terminal comes in. Let's say that neurotransmitter, after it binds with this receptor, it does its function. Then what happens is we have to get that neurotransmitter back into this axon terminal to incorporate it back into this vesicle. How do we do that? We use this reuptake protein. So you use a reuptake protein present here to move that neurotransmitter back in to the axon terminal. And then maybe from there, maybe it has to undergo a couple enzymatic steps, but either way, it'll get put back into the vesicle and recycled. That's important. Why is that important? Let's say this neurotransmitter is serotonin. Sometimes it's written as 5-hydroxytryptamine, 5-HT. The reuptake protein would be called a serotonin reuptake protein. If you give a drug called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like Zoloft, Lexapro, all of those things, Prozac, those are going to inhibit these reuptake proteins. Why is that important? Now that neurotransmitter can't be brought back into this actual axon terminal, and it sits out in this synapse continuously stimulating this cell. That could be important whenever that excess 5-hydroxytryptamine is needed to improve mood in people with depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders. So that's why this is so important, that you know sometimes the basic functions of these components of the neuron. All right, that covers axon terminal. All right, so we talked about the basic structure and functions of the different parts of the neuron. Now, what we have to remember is that when we talk about neurons, and we might use a lot of this terminology throughout the process of all the neurology videos in our playlist, is that you have to know how the neurons are classified. Less commonly, they're used in a structural classification. More commonly, especially throughout the process of all the videos that you guys are going to watch, it's going to be more functional classification that we're going to talk about. So to get this part out of the way, because it is a little boring, I'm not going to lie to you, let's just talk about what these things are and where you can find them. So the first one here is this multipolar neuron. So let's just write these out. This is your multipolar neuron. And I'll explain why in a second. This one here is called your bipolar neuron. Okay, this is called your bipolar neuron. And this last one over here is called your pseudo unipolar neuron. And I'll explain why all of this, and then we'll talk about where you can find them and why you'd be finding them there. So the multipolar neurons, the reason they're called that, it's very simple. Look at how many dendritic extensions I have coming off. If I have 3+ dendritic extensions coming off, that's enough for me to call this a multipolar neuron. Multiple dendritic extensions with a cell body and an axon extension, that's a multipolar. If I only see one dendritic extension, so one dendritic extension, we'll put DE, and one axon coming from the cell body, that's a bipolar neuron. It's not hard, right? Pseudo-unipolar is really weird. It doesn't really have a dendrite, and it doesn't really have like a distinguishable axon with a terminal kind of thing. It has here your peripheral process. So here's the cell body. Okay, here's the cell body of it. Then you have this process coming from the cell body, usually out to your periphery. So we call this the peripheral process. And then this part from the cell body going towards the central nervous system, we call this part the central process. So pretty straightforward, okay? Now the important thing is to know where you can find these things and why you would generally find them there for the most part. Multipolar neurons, think about it, they have tons of dendrites. What does that mean? What does dendrites do? They're the receptive region. So they have to receive signals from multiple neurons all over the place. Think about the primary motor cortex. Who does he have to receive information from? Because that's an example of a multipolar neuron. He would have to receive information from Your basal ganglia. You know your basal ganglia? They have to send information to your motor cortex. You know your sensory cortex? It has to send information to the motor cortex. You know your cerebellum? It has to send information to your motor cortex. What else would send information there? You also have other motor areas, which are called your premotor cortex, and your supplementary motor cortex would have to send information there. So it has to have all these receptive regions and then have an axon that goes down to your spinal cord. That's an example of a multipolar neuron. Multiple receptive regions with an axon going down. Same thing, this is literally the same concept. Your cerebellum. So obviously if we were to give an example here, just pick motor cortex as one example. The second example, pick your cerebellum. And if we're really being specific about what type of neurons they actually give these neurons in the motor cortex, they call them pyramidal cells. And the cerebellum, we call them Purkinje cells, if you truly want to know that. I want you to get the basic concept though. Where is the information? Multiple receptive regions. Your spinal cord, picking up sensations, proprioceptive sensation. Picking up information about your equilibrium from your inner ear. Picking up information from your motor cortex about the particular motor plan that you have to move. All of that has to go to the cerebellum. And then the cerebellum from there can send its information to tons of different areas. But you see how there's multiple receptive regions and then an axon extension. That's an example of multipolar neurons. Bipolar neurons are really weird, and you find these mainly in your special sensory organs. Which ones? The retina has bipolar neurons. We talk about really where, like what they do, because these don't really generate action potentials. They generate what's called graded potentials. We talk about that in our special senses playlist. The other one is your olfactory epithelium, which are present in the roof of the nasal cavity. So also the olfactory nerves. They're also examples of bipolar neurons. And then one more is your inner ear, particularly like the vestibule and the semicircular canals are also example of bipolar neurons. So best way to remember this is mainly your special sensory organs is really where you'll find bipolar neurons. The last one is your pseudounipolar. Your pseudounipolar is actually very important. I really want you to remember this one. The main area where you're going to hear them tons and tons and tons of times throughout the neurology playlist is your dorsal root ganglion. Your dorsal root ganglion, which is located outside of your spinal cord. So here is going to be what's called the cell body, that part there. It has a peripheral process, we said, right? That peripheral process may be going to the skin. Let's just put here skin. We're just going to write skin. Picking up sensations from the skin, taking it down this peripheral process to where the cell body is, then into the central process. And from here, it may synapse somewhere in your spinal cord or go up to your brain, okay? So this is an example of the pseudounipolar neuron, but it's located outside of the outside of the central nervous system, and a bunch of cell bodies located outside of the peripheral nervous system are called a ganglia. And since it's near the dorsal root, that's why we call it a dorsal root ganglia. All right, beautiful. Last but not least is certain cranial nerves have pseudounipolar neurons. Classical example, is cranial nerve 5. The cranial nerve 5, which is your trigeminal nerve, your trigeminal ganglion. This is a perfect example. You know, there's a ganglia that sits here inside, kind of like outside within the skull base here. And it has 3 divisions. One is called a ophthalmic division, a maxillary division, and a mandibular division, right? But they're picking up sensations all from the face. Those sensations travel down the peripheral processes to the cell body. From the cell body, you have a central process that goes into the central nervous system to the nucleus inside of your brainstem, which is your trigeminal nucleus. That's another example of a pseudounipolar neuron. All right, beautiful. That's the structural classification. Let's hit the functional, more important one. All right, so we talked about the structural classification of neurons. Now let's talk about the one that you're probably going to hear a lot of throughout the process of our neurology lectures, which is the functional classification. So when we talk about neurons, they can be sensory neurons, motor neurons, or interneurons. Now, what the heck does that mean? I want to establish some terminology here. So sensations, it can pick up sensations from your viscera, maybe sensations from the lungs, from the heart, from the GIT, from the urogenital tract. Those visceral sensations are going from these organs to your actual central nervous system, in this case, the brain or the spinal cord. So that's called afferent information. So sensory information is also referred to as afferent information. So you can have neurons that are taking sensory information or afferent information to your CNS. But since this is coming from the viscera, we give this a special term, which is called general visceral afferent neurons. This is terms that will come up later in the lectures, okay? It's important to know that one. The next one is you could be picking up sensations from your skin or from your skeletal muscles or from your joints, your ligaments, all of those areas. This is somatic sensation. So when it's somatic, meaning it's coming from skin, muscle, joints. When I mean muscle, I mean skeletal muscle, okay? Joints, ligaments. That sensory information can be taken to your brain or spinal cord, but that is called general somatic afferent fibers. Okay, next one. You could be having sensory information being conducted from your special sensory organs, which are going to be responsible for vision and hearing. If this is traveling towards your actual central nervous system and it's coming from a special sensory organ, very particular here, from the eyes or ears, this is called special sensory afferent fibers, SSA fibers. Okay? Last but not least, if the sensations that are being taken to your central nervous system, afferent information through these sensory neurons, are coming from your smell or from taste and going to your central nervous system, that is a special sense, but it's more visceral. So it's called special visceral afferent neurons. So these are terms that I want you to understand whenever they come up in future lectures. All right. The next one is the motor neurons. Motor neurons are taking efferent information. That means they're going away from the central nervous system and going to the effector organ here. In this case, it could be going to your visceral organs. Maybe it's going to the smooth muscle within the respiratory bronchi. Maybe it's going to the cardiac muscle within the heart. Maybe it's going to glands, which are going to be present all in different places. That type of information is autonomic information, but it's visceral and it's motor and it's going away from the central nervous system. So these fibers that are going to be motor fibers from central nervous system to viscera for smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and gland activity is called general visceral efferent neurons. The motor neurons that are going from the central nervous system away towards the effector organ, in this case, skeletal muscle, right? Skeletal muscle, this is somatic function. So this is called general somatic efferent neurons, which are taking motor information from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles. Last but not least, the ridiculous ones here. They love to give extra names to make everything complicated for us, but there's going to be nerves that go to special muscles around the head and neck area that are carried by a couple different nerves. Cranial nerve 5, which is your trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 7, which is your facial nerve. Cranial nerve 9, which is your glossopharyngeal nerve. And cranial nerve 10, which is your vagus nerve. These will supply muscles of the head and neck region from a particular embryological thing called your pharyngeal arches. And really, the best way to remember them is correlating with the nerve. So cranial nerve 5 supplies the first pharyngeal arch. Cranial nerve 7 supplies the second pharyngeal arch. Glossopharyngeal supplies the third pharyngeal arch. And then the vagus supplies the fourth and the sixth pharyngeal arch. And again, these are skeletal muscles, but they're muscles that are basically a part of the head and neck that are derived from these embryological origin. And so we don't call them general somatic efferents. We got to be complicated and call them special visceral efferent neurons. All right, beautiful. Let's move on to the last part. All right, so the last functional classification of neurons is interneurons. It's literally what it sounds like. It's the neurons between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. That's it. So I want you to think about this. We had that motor cortex, right? Up in the cerebral cortex in your frontal lobe. This motor cortex is going to send its motor fibers down, and it technically goes to neurons in your spinal cord, right? Lower motor neurons. And that goes out to your skeletal muscles, right? But this is the motor pathway. This entire red line is your motor pathway. Coming from maybe the skin, or maybe even from the actual muscle itself, because you have receptors there as well, you can have these particular sensory receptors that are taking information in. And when they go in, this is your sensory fiber here, it may stop off on a particular neuron in between the motor and the sensory. Now, what is this one? This is a particular nucleus we'll talk about later in another video. For right now, I just want you to think about it as just kind of a relay neuron. So if this is a relay neuron, let's actually switch the color here. Let's make this green so that we know the difference here. This relay neuron may fire some action potentials to another relay neuron. And then that relay neuron may fire some action potentials to this motor, to the actual motor cortex, right? So think about this. You have your sensory fibers, which are taking sensations into your central nervous system. They may be going up and then dropping off on some relay neurons, which will then go back and stimulate your motor neurons. You see how that's in between here? That's called your interneurons. To give you kind of an idea so that you can see that I'm not making these things up, this later we'll talk about is in the medulla, a part of your dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. This is called your nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, right? So these are going to be two that you'll talk about. That's an example of an interneuron. Your thalamus. You know your thalamus has tons of different nuclei. And it also has the ability to send its action potentials to the motor cortex as well. So it's important to realize that when we're talking about interneurons, these interneurons make up most of your central nervous system. And commonly, we only refer to them into the spinal cord, but they're all throughout that brain and brainstem, baby. So to give you the classic example of an interneuron, with the spinal reflex, it's pretty straightforward. Think about this. You have a sensation coming from the skin. Someone touches your skin. That sensation then does what? It moves